Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Manage Organizational Change and Cultural Impact During a Cloud Transformation. My name is Joe Chung, and I'm an enterprise strategist with Amazon Web Services. As a former senior IT executive who has led a cloud transformation, my role is to work with customers and help them understand what a journey to AWS looks like. I'd also like to introduce Amanda Rankin, who is with AWS's professional services organization and part of our migration practice, advising on people and organization best practices. Amanda was instrumental in pulling today's content together and will be co-presenting with me during today's session. In addition, we will have a few other moderators join us from AWS's ProServe advisory practice, in particular Eric Winter, who has contributed to some of our best thinking around cloud centers of excellence.
So let's talk about the areas that we'll cover today. The first is to talk about cloud transformations and why a cloud transformation can have such an impact on an organization, people, and culture. And in fact, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about culture because it's such an important, critical subject. Second, for those who are not familiar with organizational change and management frameworks, I'll briefly cover that at a pretty high level. What I find is many infrastructure organizations are not as used to driving projects with change management in mind. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time discussing them. And finally, we'll talk about how to apply an organizational change management framework to the cloud journey and share some best practices harvested from customer successes. So we'll look to spend about 30 minutes going through the content and reserve the final 10 minutes for any follow-up questions. So let's talk about why the cloud is different. The cloud is not just about some hosting arbitrage opportunity. The AWS platform provides customers with instant access to infrastructure and application services through a pay-as-you-go pricing model where you never have to worry about the capacity being provisioned. Developers love what the cloud can provide in terms of practically instant access to IT resources like servers, storage, and networking, but even artificial intelligence services like our recognition service, which allows through an API to be able to recognize objects and scenes and any number of picture formats. On-premise infrastructure has historically been managed via people, and even with the advancements in server virtualization, most companies have not been able to implement the levels of automation that the cloud can provide. AWS resources can be provisioned via APIs or application programming interfaces, thus allowing services to be provisioned as code, enabling full automation. So as a result, roles and responsibilities within an IT organization will change as application teams now have the ability to take more control over their infrastructure and application services. Therefore, implementing a cloud platform like AWS will not only affect your infrastructure organization, but also your application workloads. May even impact your business models, can touch your HR processes and procurement processes as well. AWS resources can be provisioned and managed through a number of automated mechanisms, and cloud adoption can get bogged down or not reach its maximum potential if companies do not consider the impact that the cloud has on an organization's culture, people, and processes. When I speak with customers, I often share that a journey to the cloud is somewhat more akin to perhaps something like ERP implementation that many organizations embarked on 20 plus years ago. You didn't just screw in a big ERP tool without revisiting the people, the roles, and the processes involved. So what is culture? There are a number of great definitions of culture, but most seem to converge on this notion of shared values and beliefs which govern how people behave in an organization. In many cases, those values aren't explicitly defined, and it's something that is learned through tribal knowledge. One example that happened to me recently in my life is my son being in middle school, takes the bus, and one of the things that happened recently to some new students who decided to ride the bus or were being bused to school was encountering the fact that older kids sit in the back of the bus and newer kids sit, or the younger kids sit in the front. And it was sort of a rude sort of behavior to kind of encounter when you're not accustomed to understanding what the culture is in an organization. The reason why culture is important to tackle as part of a cloud journey is that it changes the speed of provisioning and management and the economics of infrastructure and IT services. Decisions to expand capacity in a data center is expensive and slow, and therefore lots of controls have to be put in place to ensure that an organization is making a wise investment, making the right bet, and is economical for the organization. But with the whole pay-as-you-go on-demand access to IT resources, the decision-making process can change. Therefore, we see more and more companies moving to a spirit of or a culture of more experimentation, more rapid iteration, decentralization as the ability to provision and instantiate these resources. The costs are dramatically lower, so you don't have to put as much ceremony behind these decisions. And there are a few more listed on the slide that I won't drain, but hopefully people start to see a pattern here. And again, we see this as a pretty common thread as organizations look to become more agile as they drive things like digital transformation in their companies. We believe culture is critical to address in a cloud journey. Many people believe changing a company's culture is super hard and difficult and perhaps impossible, but we believe there are some levers that can influence culture. And certainly while it may be difficult to imagine impacting a company's overall culture, I think there are certainly many cases where even within teams and organizations, let's say as part of the technology organization, you do have some control to be able to change and influence the culture. Some of the levers that can help influence culture are just communicating what the new cultural values are going to be, or to set some new rules of engagement around how people are going to interact, perhaps instituting something like a cloud governance model, to using this concept of personal branding to help people who may have had a passion around certain aspects like cloud, and to be able to allow them to step up and reinforcing and recognizing new behaviors and new ways of working. And certainly leading from the front is a super important part of any cloud journey. And we'll cover these more in detail in the later part of the webinar. Just as an example, Amazon codifies our culture in a set of 14 leadership principles. The leadership at Amazon carefully revisits all of these principles. These cultural values are extremely important to us. It's how we hire people. It's how we manage people through kind of performance management actions. And it really drives the behaviors of the entire organization. We do hear a lot of interest from customers on how we innovate and build products. And personally, having shared with many organizations Amazon's culture of innovation, we always anchor back to, and I always share these leadership principles. But the important point here is that we focus on these, we communicate these. It's an important part of what we do, and we talk about them all the time, which is an important part of any cultural journey that an organization is trying to do to continue to steward and shepherd their values. So how do you influence cultural change? To build on some of the levers that I covered in the prior slide, it first starts with just spending some time to write down what those values are. Again, it doesn't have to be the values for the entire company, but perhaps it's the values for your cloud organization or for your technology organization. The second aspect is to be able to communicate those values. It's one thing to define and write them down, but if they're kept in a box, it's not really going to be helpful in driving that cultural change and communicating those values. The third is to begin to reinforce these values explicitly and implicitly. It could be through recognition, ceremony of where people observe certain behaviors and can recognize and call people out. It's something that my organization did. I've seen other organizations do this as well. It could be something as simple as having taken some training related to the cloud, or perhaps demonstrating a behavior that shows agility and operating in the new. And then finally, it's super important to make sure that you hire or select individuals that align to and embody the values that you're seeking to drive. It's always hard to kind of have somebody who's going to be a continual detractor, perhaps a naysayer. I think what it's really important is to get people who are really excited about driving the change and letting them loose as change agents in your organization. I think most senior executives do recognize that people, organizational, and cultural change is one of their biggest challenges. I speak to customers regularly on a weekly basis, and a lot of them are early in their cloud journey. And this concern around people and culture comes up a lot. But I still think it's pretty rare for companies to understand what resources and capabilities are required to be put in place to really drive a meaningful change effort. And as you can see here, 70% of unsupported change efforts fail to achieve their outcomes. And I think it really has to do with that lack of understanding what's required to drive that change. So as a result, there's some pretty common failure points that come up as people embark on these journeys. They range from lack of visible sponsorship. Perhaps it's a leader who stands up once in front of the organization, says this is what we're going to do, and you sort of never hear from that person again. To lack of change management resourcing and really putting the capabilities and the people in place to help drive this journey. To resistance. Every large organization has organizational inertia, and it can be hard to turn and change those values and those behaviors. And that resistance will come both from the kind of middle management, upper management, to the rank and file employees. So let's switch gears and talk about change management. Change management is simply applying tools and processes to the people side of the change to transition from a current state to a future state to successfully achieve a particular outcome. You know, I hear from many customers that they have a cloud-first strategy. It's pretty rare for me in my conversations for someone not to recognize the power that the cloud can provide to an organization. But what's a bit more rare is organizations who know how to move from a statement of intent to actual execution and being able to drive a meaningful change, particularly one at the cultural and at the organization people level.
Thank you, Joe, for setting the stage for a discussion around how to get started with the more challenging goal of executing meaningful change. This is a great place to introduce you to some key principles and best practices in the field of organizational change management. First, change management is an enabling framework for the people side of change. In other words, successful change across an entire enterprise does not just happen organically. It requires a concerted effort. Joe will talk through our approach to change management framework for cloud adoption here in just a moment. Next, organizational change requires individual change. This is one that I think is important to spend some time on. We tend to think in terms of organizational change, things like communications that are key to share at what time and to which groups, how to build momentum by celebrating wins, promoting successes, and things along those lines. But in order to be successful in affecting change on an organizational level, you have to be successful in achieving change on an individual level, employee by employee. Organizational change outcomes are the collective result of those individual changes. Here, I think it's really helpful to provide an example of how this plays out in practice, and maybe you've had similar experiences and can relate. So in the spirit of being vocally self-critical, which is an important part of the Amazon culture, by the way, I'd like to share a story where I personally missed the mark as a leader of business change in a prior role a number of years ago. In this previous company and from the leadership position that I was in at the time, it had become increasingly clear to me over a number of months that a pivot was needed in our service offering. I spent a ton of time researching, talking to our customers, collecting feedback on business that we had lost and why, talking to peer group colleagues, and that type of background deep dive. I was so excited and energized and certain I had hit on what we needed to do. I built a plan, mapped it out, and started sharing my ideas with key people in the organization. I remember so vividly scheduling this meeting with my team to walk them through the plan. I was positive that they would immediately see the value proposition for our customers, their opportunity to add value, to learn new skills and contribute in a new and exciting way. Customers would win, employees would win, and my biggest concern was how to handle all their offers to jump in and help. You can probably guess this was not at all what happened. It was quite the opposite. The team sat there looking blindsided for what felt like forever. And then came a number of different reactions, none of them what I'd call positive. And so this goes to a number of tenets on this slide. What I believed I was communicating was this exciting opportunity, and what I found out later was that people heard something different. They were afraid. They went home and spoke to their spouses, and what they shared about this exciting new opportunity was something along the lines of, wow, I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to have a job. What she's talking about sounds great and exciting for someone, but not for me. I'm not qualified to do that. I don't know anything about how to deliver a service like that. And I wonder how much time I have to find something else. Wow, I couldn't believe it. What I learned was that employees experience change in stages and as individuals, that it's a personal experience and it happens one person at a time. Each individual employee decides how to react, whether they will get on board with the change or dig in and fight it. In other words, again, we tend to approach change management with a broad brush, when the reality is that when a business mandate is communicated, the organization as a whole doesn't get together and take a vote on how they feel about what's happening or make a group decision about how to react. Each employee hears the message and makes an individual decision. It's the collective output that determines success or failure at the organizational level. In other words, it's an individual personal experience, and it's that collective result of those experiences which determine the organizational result. Awareness here can make a really big difference. That experience changed the way I think about leading and communicating change initiatives. So next, the scope and type of change inform the change management plan. We'll talk about this more in the next slide, but essentially this simply means applying the right set of tools for the job in front of you. Employee resistance is the rule and not the exception. It's really just important to be aware of this going in and adjust expectations accordingly and not be surprised or caught off guard by it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and when you expect it, I think people tend to react a little bit differently. Unlike in the example that I gave earlier. So creating and executing against an organizational change management framework will help here as well, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Next, the right solution is absolutely not in and of itself enough of an explanation to motivate employees to join the mission. I love this one because I think it's a fairly easy one to see how this happens. We get very excited, and rightly so, about the benefits of rolling out a new solution, implementing more automation, finding new and exciting ways of doing things, highlighting the business value to our customer base and to the organization. So it's interesting to note that research tells us that regardless of how right the solution is that we're talking about, or how much of a no-brainer that shift may be in terms of getting everyone to a better place than they were previously, this knowledge, even when they see the value in it, is not in and of itself enough to motivate employees to get on board. In other words, when you're first communicating a change effort, like moving to the cloud, speaking to the value of the solution alone isn't enough. They are initially still processing the question, what's in it for me? So back to the example I shared at the beginning of the slide, in terms of communication plans and strategies, it's just important to keep in mind that the message that we intend to convey is not always the same message that is perceived on the other end. Change agents need to be mindful of how we're communicating, and the more focused the messaging can be, the better. It's a tricky one because I think we're all aware this happens, but how do we get proactive about perception? How can we know what we're walking into, or how someone will perceive a message? This is another place where a structured organizational change management, or OCM, approach can really make a difference. It helps with that goal of creating focused communication that's really directed at a specific audience at a specific point in time. Last, and probably most importantly, we go through all of this for a reason. The goal of any kind of change is to get to a better place, hopefully a substantially better place, which is why, like so many other critical success factors, we need a way to manage the work so we can achieve our goals or know when we're heading off track and then have the opportunity to make a course correction. So this slide here really speaks to one of our organizational change management tenets, which is that the scope and type of change should inform the change management plan. And this really comes down to selecting the appropriate tools and approach for the job at hand. Not all change is the same. So if you have a project that's primarily about changing tool sets, or you're looking to improve what already is subsystem change focused, the new state target is really about enhancing a prior state, then this we would call an improvement. And on the next slide, we'll share what types of change management levers are appropriate for this type of smaller impact change. The next column is looking at transitional change, where the focus is not only on changing tool sets and skill sets, for example, like EMR systems, a product or service redesign, and things of that nature, where you're looking to design and implement a new state, dismantle an old state, where transition process is needed. And you have to really think about, how are you going to get from point A to point B, and what is that bridge going to look like, and what's the process around that? Process value stream change focused is another thing that comes to mind. But there's a defined timetable. So these types of change efforts fall into the transitional change bucket. And here you're looking to change tool sets and skill sets. Last, and this is where we tend to focus for more cloud transformation initiatives, is on transformational change. The key difference here is that for this type of business change, we're looking at the impact and effect changing tool sets and skill sets has on changing mindsets. Examples would be business model changes, shifting to high automation, customer experience redesign initiatives, and of course, cloud transformation. Where current state and worldview modifications are happening, where the new state may not be clearly defined, and instead you'll be discovering that as part of the change effort process. Where major organizational system changes are happening, fundamental shifts in strategy, operating model, processes, views of customers and performance, leadership governance, and culture are expected and desired. In other words, mindsets need to shift for success to occur. This doesn't happen through technology change alone. Okay, so what are the appropriate solutions for the different types of change? I think the key thing to consider in this slide is really that there are common threads in each column, and the larger the change, the more robust the plan that's required. Communication is always important in any change effort. People need to be aware of what's happening and what to expect. Applying a change management approach is needed. And depending on the magnitude of the change, that may mean a light effort, as is the case with an improvement-focused change, or it may require a much more robust approach if we're talking about a business transformation. So with that in mind, let's focus in on the last column. For cloud transformation, in addition to change communication and management, project management, training, change leadership, process design, things of that nature, we also want to provide a framework for addressing that mind shift that needs to occur. How can we best lead our people through this, recognizing there may be attitudes and behaviors embedded in our organizational culture that are conducive to cloud adoption, and there may be aspects which are not? How do we put our people in the best possible position to succeed? Which takes us to the next step in our discussion. How do we accomplish all of this in the context of cloud transformation? For this piece, I will hand it back over to Joe to discuss our approach.
So finally, let's talk about how to tactically apply a change management approach to a cloud journey. And there are certainly many different change management frameworks, but many do converge on a similar set of themes and actions. The first phase is mobilizing your team and your leadership. It's super important to dedicate a team and have the senior leadership and the sponsorship that comes along with it. Otherwise, you end up with what I call a hobby project. And I don't know about you, I never seem to have time to work on all my hobbies. And it's something that just kind of falls to the wayside. The second phase is about defining your vision and your direction, envisioning that future and engaging with the organization. And then third, it's really about the implementation, how you make it happen, and how you make your changes enduring and making it stick. So we'll go into each of these areas in the next few slides. So in this mobilization phase, what we're really looking for in terms of objectives are confirmation of sponsorship. And it's not just a single person in terms of sponsorship. My opinion is the sponsorship, particularly at the senior executive level, has to be within the business, certainly within the technology organization, with the security or CISO organization, as well as HR and procurement. You need to be able to secure resources and build that coalition of leaders. In my opinion, I like to see single-threaded leadership, somebody who, if they're going to be picked to help lead this journey, has the required bandwidth. One of the red flags for me is when I hear of a cloud leader whose responsibility to drive that journey is something like 5 to 10% of their responsibility. It typically means that they just do not have the bandwidth to drive that change in the organization. The key actions are to be able to set up that cloud organization, to be able to shape the overall program governance structure, and to start to begin to assign some change leadership roles. Some of the best practices, and oftentimes people will ask, well, can you show me an org chart? And there's no one organizational model that works for every single organization. The slide that I'm showing here is a bit more illustrative and more of a functional organization, but we do see some commonalities in these cloud centers of excellence. It's not uncommon to have a cloud engineering or a cloud platform team that's focused on building out the infrastructure and the operations and the security processes. And then to have a cloud business office that's focused more on things like, how are you going to architect applications in the future? What is your application strategy going to be as you move from on-premise infrastructure to the cloud? To things like financial considerations. Because of the pay-as-you-go nature and the ability to provision infrastructure very quickly, it's important to have the financial discipline and some of the key things like tagging taxonomies defined so that organizations can know where their costs are being incurred and by which teams. Then, of course, there's training and engagement in organizational change management. Sometimes you'll see the migration factory, as sometimes it's called, sitting on the cloud engineering side or on the cloud business office side. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that what you see here is a cross-functional view of the organization. It's not uncommon for us to also see that the organization, the CCOE, starts small. It's certainly very difficult to secure 20, 30 resources from the get-go, but certainly starting with a core group that you can build off of to evolve into a more robust cloud capability is something that we see quite regularly with customers. Then it's about, once you have that team picked and you have the right leaders, then it's about articulating that vision and roadmap for that transition to the cloud. It's about building that momentum and starting to communicate out to the organization what a technology organization plans to do with the cloud. I find this is a great time to document some of the cultural values that you want to drive in terms of agility. Just as an example, one cloud tenant that my organization had was one that said something like, we want to make our cloud experience as fast as if a developer put their own credit card down and provisioned an AWS account. And the reason why we felt compelled to document something like that is we didn't want AWS to turn into another on-prem data center where things get kind of bogged down by tickets and approvals. And we really wanted to engineer something that would provide agility for developers and application teams. But on the flip side, we also said that we want to adhere fully to our security principles for the organization. So it didn't mean that we would just kind of go rogue with everything. We wanted to be disciplined. And we find that when organizations do that, it's a little bit clearer because it's not often that you can define every single policy and dictate every single thing that a team will do. Oftentimes, it's a little bit better to focus on principles where it gives you a little bit more freedom and you can build a little bit more trust and have some values that can guide the organization as opposed to many, many policies and trying to document each one of those things. And then finally, it's about enabling the capacity and making it stick. This is where we often see organizations start to define what that future state will look like. As the cloud CCOE helps instantiate AWS in an organization, then you start to see some ripple impacts. What is that developer experience going to be? How much freedom are you going to give? And how are the roles going to change as infrastructure and application organizations evolve? And we'll cover a few other kind of best practices and areas that we've seen organizations struggle with as they try to move and implement this new model. One thing that we talk about a lot is making sure that an organization defines their operating model and understanding where you want to be. Most people have these extremes in mind where maybe on the left side, you have more of a traditional kind of managed services style model. Many customers have outsourced their infrastructure capabilities or application capabilities to other organizations. And then on the flip side, you have this kind of DevOps world where application teams have full ownership of the services that they need and can provision them at any time. Most organizations are looking to move somewhere towards the middle. And I would also argue that many companies will have multiple operating models. But what's important is to be able to decide explicitly where you want to be, because how you decide which operating model, whether it leans more to DevOps, or perhaps it's just an evolution of your run-of-the-mill ITIL-based processes, it's important to communicate where you want to be, because that will help inform you how you design your roles and the policies and the governance that you want to put in place to be able to leverage the cloud. And the other area that comes up quite a bit is this idea of how will the roles evolve. AWS has recently rolled out some training that's available for the public to consume that shares a little bit of how we think roles will evolve from your legacy IT roles to perhaps more of a cloud role. One of the things that does seem to be a theme and is a mantra that that I shared with my organization is that we want our infrastructure admins to become engineers. It was our vision and our belief that coding was not something just relegated to software engineers, but with the power of the cloud and for IT infrastructure resources to be managed as code, it meant that our infrastructure organization needed to also evolve to become more software engineering-like and move away from more of the admin-based capabilities. At this time, I'd like to thank you for your time. Hopefully you were able to pick up some good nuggets of information. And at AWS, we're continuing to work with customers as we learn and grow as large and small organizations make this transition to the cloud. But we'd love to hear from you and what questions you have. So at this time, I'd like to open the webinar up for our Q&A portion.